Turkey seized control of a key highway near the border in northeast Syria, meaning U.S. troops in the area may have to rely on airlifts to get out. Stateside, President Trump's abrupt shift in policy has triggered a growing bipartisan backlash.
So Turkey's latest move in northern Syria has complicated the situation for US troops who are attempting to leave. And this is, of course, following Donald Trump's abrupt decision to abandon our Kurdish allies in the region and allow for Turkey to move forward with its military operation. Now, there's other news, including the involvement of Russia. But before we get to that, let me give you the details on what's going on in terms of Turkey's latest actions. Trump declared that Turkey's offensive undermines the campaign to defeat the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, endangers civilians, and further threatens to undermine the peace, security, and stability in the region. Now, part of the reason why US troops were in that region to begin with was to prevent all of these things from happening. Now that US troops are leaving, there are ISIS prisoners who are escaping the very prisons that our former Kurdish allies were keeping an eye on. Obviously, their priority now is to save themselves and to save their own lives as a result of this Turkish aggression. But the order that Donald Trump signed is in regard to sanctions. It's a $100 billion trade deal hammered out between Ankara and Washington, raises tariffs on Turkish steel to 50% and imposes sanctions on senior Turkish officials and the country's defense and energy ministries. So with that said, and before we move on to what Russia's doing, I wanted to kind of open this up to the panel and get your thoughts on it.
Well, I mean, it's a predictable consequence of Trump's decision to pull out of northern Syria. I mean, Turkey would not be doing any of this without the sort of tacit acquiescence of the United States. I think Erdogan himself was probably surprised that Trump agreed to do this move in the first place. It's one of those things that's Trump himself is such an easy person to read in this sense because he's very obvious. Like he just says the thing openly, the thing that past US leaders would couch in sort of like humanitarian terms and sort of like slippery foreign policy speak. He just kind of outright says it. But this has been sort of a ongoing move the United States has done several times in the past. I mean, the Kurds are sort of a very easy pawn for the United States to sort of use in various different geopolitical chess matches, and the sort of playbook has always been the same exact thing. So this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise, but it's no less depressing and horrifying. So can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that? Because I agree with you that Trump isn't subtle as previous presidents have been. He says the quiet parts out loud. But what do you mean when you say that similar things have happened in the past? Well, I mean, it's there's so many examples, it's almost impossible to go through them all right now. But I mean, whether it was in the early 90s or in the 1980s or in World War II, World War I, like the Kurds are kind of this perfect pawn for United States interests because they're a sort of stateless people that exist across various states where the United States has geopolitical interests. Some of them are our friends, some of them are our enemies. And at whatever point in time our enemies kind of need to be dealt with, we'll arm and support the Kurds. But then when our friends who also have to deal with Kurdish minorities within their own countries, whenever they get a little worried about sort of these uppity Kurds, then we'll abandon them. And that same exact dynamic has happened over and over and over again. Yeah, and in this case, you have Turkey, a NATO ally, wanting to invade northern Syria, and then Donald Trump decides to abandon our Kurdish allies to make way for Turkey. Now, he has received so much backlash, and it's bipartisan backlash, that he's trying to make it appear as though he didn't intend for it to work out this way, that he didn't give a green light to this Turkish aggression, but he knew what was going on. I mean, in one of the original statements released by the White House, they specifically said, Trump told Erdogan, if you're gonna do like a mild military operation, we're gonna keep our troops there. But if you're gonna do an aggressive military operation, we're gonna pull our troops out. Yeah, that's letting Erdogan know, if you wanna go, if you wanna play, we'll play along with you and pull our troops out. I mean, anyway, Adrienne.
Well, it's This is very much on par for Donald Trump, essentially. Having him withdraw the troops from northern Syria, it really just undoes all the progress that's been done. And that's essentially what he's done here in the United States. This is his MO. This is what he does. He rolls things back so that anything that's been good, progressive, moving in the direction of stability is now unfolded, and we see how it plays out, and then pretending like, oop, I didn't know it was gonna happen. It's just, this is how this man operates.
He doesn't really strike me as someone who really has a plan or a strategy. It just really depends on the last person who spoke to him. And this is true of all of his policy, right? And so he has this conversation with Erdogan, and abruptly he decides, I'm gonna go ahead and abandon our Kurdish allies after they helped us fight ISIS. And keep in mind, those ISIS fighters were being watched by these Kurdish allies, now former Kurdish allies. And so again, they're escaping some of these prisons, which poses a danger. Like, what was the point? What was the point of trying to fight ISIS if you're gonna have Donald Trump, just undo, you're right, undo all of the progress that was made there. Now, let's talk a little bit more about these sanctions, because some of our other allies have gotten involved. So NPR reports that US NATO allies have halted weapons exports to Turkey. That includes France and Germany. And with the US withdrawing from the border area, Russia says its military is now acting as a buffer between Turkish and Syrian troops. Also, the Kurds have they've spoken to Assad, Bashar al-Assad, and he has agreed to offer some sort of protection. So we'll see how that plays out. But Syria, the civil war that was happening in Syria was very much a proxy war. And with all of these updates, it's very clear that that proxy war continues. There are all these other world interests that are getting involved. You have Turkey involved, obviously. You have Russia, you have Iran. It's not a good situation at all. And it didn't have to go down this way. Trump just decided randomly after having a conversation to do this.
Although I really do wonder kind of what's in it for him, because he doesn't do anything without having a motivation. So I don't know what that conversation necessarily entailed, or what conversations he's having with Putin, or what other foreign leaders to essentially set himself up. So maybe there'll be a Trump hotel on a new island somewhere.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. You're right. I mean, everything that he does is based on self-interest.
Yes.
And also whether or not the person he's speaking to is complimentary toward him. So a few more pieces of info that you should be aware of. How disastrous has this been for civilians in the area? Nearly 70,000 children have been displaced since hostilities escalated last week. And that's according to estimates by UNICEF, adding that 170,000 children may need humanitarian aid as a result of violence in the border region. But here's the issue, some of the organizations that have been offering humanitarian aid in the area have left because they're worried about their own lives given this Turkish aggression. Also, Kurds have announced that deal with the Russian and Iranian-backed government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to back them against the Turkish onslaught. And finally, I want to read this quote from Donald Trump. This is a tweet that he posted. Let Syria and Assad protect the Kurds and fight Turkey for their own land. Anyone who wants to assist Syria in protecting the Kurds is good with me, whether it is Russia, China, or Napoleon. I hope they all do great. We are 7,000 miles away. But here's the thing. This is not an example of us doing an interventionist war. This was us working with the Kurds to defeat ISIS. And what Donald Trump did is basically throw them aside as soon as he got what he wanted.
Yeah, and it bears repeating that in that war against ISIS, the Kurds are the ones who bore the brunt of it. I mean, I think they lost something like 11,000 fighters in the fight against ISIS. Obviously way less than the United States suffered. And they were really the troops that were at the front lines fighting ISIS day in and day out, while at the same time doing a sort of very inspiring experiment in radical democracy, radical gender equality in the region. They had women were some of their top commanders in the militaries, also in the local governments and the sort of radically democratic governments that they established in the middle of this incredibly brutal and incredibly complex civil war, war against ISIS, Assad, the Turks, everything. Despite that, they were able to sort of build this kind of new type of society. And you wonder if that is going to survive now that they're forced to sort of throw themselves in the arms of Assad. It's just doubly heinous what the United States did, and it's one of the more depressing news developments that has happened all year.
Absolutely. So anytime you hear someone on the right, but specifically members of Trump's administration, claim that they're concerned about radical Islamic terrorism or they're worried about ISIS,
it's disingenuous.
It's so disingenuous.
They don't really care about that.
Right.
Radical Islamic terrorism is a net positive for the American right. Like it really is. They don't actually care about stopping it. They love to fight it forever.
They love to cite it as in their minds, a reason why they're better on national security and rooting out extremism compared to Democrats. But in reality, just based on Trump's actions alone, it's clear that they're disingenuous. It's clear that they use this and exploit it for their own political gain here in the United States. They don't genuinely worry or care about these insurgent groups or terrorism abroad, period.
And something else that really kind of just resonates with me as we saw those numbers of children, the hundreds of thousands of kids that are displaced or in need. Essentially, those kids are gonna grow up knowing that they were victimized, violated, essentially left and abandoned because of what the United States did. And so essentially, it's just creating more enemies. And that's something that Trump has continued to do, turn our allies into enemies and create new enemies for the United States that could come back against us decades later.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.